I love the phrase, we overestimate what we can achieve in a year and underestimate what we can achieve in 10. Most people working in analytics departments for sports teams are not getting done the things that they would like to get done. They're drowning in ad hoc requests, pushing boulders up hills on data engineering tasks. In its own way, it's not as fun as it looks from the outside, just like sports science was a lot of filling up water bottles and charging GPS units. I think that we have reached a point, again, as an industry where something's got to give. Like we've gone through Moneyball 2.0, where most teams are doing something, and now they're figuring out how to do that something in an economically efficient way that's also productive to deliver to stakeholders on an appropriate timeline, which is always, we have to win on Sunday.
This episode of Ken's Neighbors is powered by Z by HP, HP's high compute workstation grade line of products and solutions. Today, I had the pleasure of interviewing Jake Schuster. So Jake is the CEO of Gemini Sports Analytics, and he actually happens to be a non-technical founder in the sports analytics space. Today, we talk about his experience as a non-technical founder, his journey as an entrepreneur, and what he's learned along the way. I really enjoyed talking with Jake. I think you will as well. Jake, welcome to the Ken's Nearest Neighbors podcast. Thank you so much for coming on.
Ken, it's great to be here. And I hope I'm not upsetting any other podcasts I've been on, but I think that this is the first instance of being a guest on one that I've listened to at least 10 episodes of, starting with our common friend Gonzo's episode, but great to be here.
Yeah, again, thank you so much for coming on. You came highly recommended from Gonzo, from Ben Taylor, or Jefferson Taylor as well. And it's really exciting for me to be able to talk to friends of friends and now new friends. So it's exciting for me, but it's also informative and educational and all the other great things.
Awesome.
So in order to get people introduced to you and your story a little bit, I'd love for you to maybe go back, and it might not be too long ago, but could you tell me a little bit about what your first experience with data was and why it was so appealing to you?
Yeah, so my previous career was working as a sports scientist with elite sports teams. That can mean a lot of things, but generally speaking, among wearing many other hats, I was the person responsible for organizing all the data that we were collecting on on the athletes for those sports teams, and advising every day on if this player needs to rest, if they should be held out of a game, if they need extra training, and if so, what kind, and all sorts of variables in between. And I wasn't taught any data skills in school. I wasn't given any software or any specialized assistance. It was just, hey, you're collecting a ton of data. You're responsible for putting the GPS kit on the player, pressing the on button, making sure you turn it off, timestamp it, etc. And I was just astonished that there weren't any tools that allowed us to do this any easier. And when I was doing my doctorate in biomechanics with the New Zealand All Blacks rugby teams for the 2016 Olympic Games, I had to learn MATLAB and SQL and Python to process force velocity and power profiling data. And that's when it got really real. And I was really searching for a solution.
That's amazing. I think that's something we run into in a lot of different domains. Essentially, there's probably something that could make our job easier, especially in the sciences. And that facilitator is very frequently data tools, data processing, a lot of these types of things. And it's cool that you're able to get your hands dirty, but it shouldn't necessarily be that way. I think one of the tenets we'll talk about a little later is how scientists should science. Right? They shouldn't necessarily have to code or do these other skills. It really help them. It really help their career if they progress. But if they're going to maximize their potential at doing the science and the discovery and owning their discipline, it's a little sad that they also have to learn a completely other different skill to make it worthwhile for them.
I think so too. And what was fascinating about that time that I didn't realize is how we were just doing basic descriptive statistics. It was just establishing, hey, what's the normative data on how many, sprinting meters a rugby player in this position is going to get in a typical match? And how do we know when it's far enough outside of the norm that we might need to check on them? And then combining that with 2 or 3 other data sources for similar questions. We weren't getting anywhere close to predictive analytics like, hey, what's the likelihood of a player getting injured if I don't rest them at all during this condensed period of the season, or what's their free agent value going to be if they score three more goals this season? And it was still so difficult. So I agree. Letting domain experts do that is so key to organizational success.
Well, there's also a lot of value that just comes from having the data and knowing how to interpret it in general. So a lot of us jump to the machine learning models. A lot of us jump to, oh, data is not useful unless it's in some format where we can make a prediction or we can make a classification or whatever it might be. And I've seen it multiple times that just having data and knowing how to use that data is a business in and of itself. It's a product or a value in and of itself. When I was in Chicago, and the guy actually lives here now, I had a friend who started this company called Zeke. And essentially, what they did is they aggregated all the information on high school football prospects and they just delivered that information to coaches. So the coaches had a lot of this subject knowledge to be able to understand and interpret that information. And the product was just consolidating this. And the reason I knew him is I worked with him to try to create a little bit more of a predictive solution to figure out who might go where and things along those lines. But they were already selling product. They were in with, I think, 50 schools, something like that. And it's just the data and then combining that data with the expertise who are the coaches in a usable way. It's, again, overlooked. And that's effectively what helps you to get the most out of your scientists or the most out of the people that are that do have that. How do you go from that first learning experience to what you're doing now? You're obviously building infrastructure. You're pretty heavily in a quantitative field and running a company in that domain. What does that journey look like?
Yeah, it really all started just with the thesis after my experience that sports teams weren't very good at using all the data that they had, and that there needed to be that there was a need to create tools that made it easier for practitioners to use all that data. And it didn't get beyond that for a while. It was just a feeling, and then I thought maybe I should make a business out of this. And then I met some engineers that had been working in professional baseball who were ready to move into something else and build with me. And we built our prototype together. My first investors I met at the gym. I don't come from a background that would have allowed me to bootstrap a business, and so it was all through networking that allowed me to go full time and lift off. And we can dive into any of that next kind of year or so, but here we are now with 27 sports team owners on the cap table, and some phenomenally savvy venture capitalists, and a little over a dozen staff.
And so, what is the type of sports team that you're working with look like? Is it across all sports? Is it individual? Is it super sporadic, or is it within certain industries? I think that from what I've seen, different leagues, different teams, they operate very differently with how they view data and how they use data. And I'm always fascinated in this concept.
Yeah, I think originally we thought we can, do everything for everyone, which is very typically naive first time founder. And we've since narrowed our focus. We have customers in the NFL, we have customers in college basketball, but we found the most momentum in soccer, and in American football, where I think there are, like other sports, there are really similar data sets being used across every team and really similar things that each team are trying to achieve. And so the solutions can be more scalable, more repeatable. I see a little bit of a sweet spot where in soccer, the staff size and the approaches and the level of kind of data system maturity and data operations maturity are very similar, whereas there's probably more variability across the American sports leagues. We also had to narrow our focus a little bit around use cases where broadly, I mean, someone could use our application for anything depending on their own data entry. But in terms of the pipelines that we currently support, we've narrowed our focus to center around roster management, meaning talent identification mostly, as well as tactics.
Amazing. And so if we rewind a little bit, just to give someone a little bit more, a better understanding of Gemini, um, how did you start working with the engineers? Like, what was that experience like? Again, coming from someone who is, I wouldn't say you're completely non-technical, but you maybe newer to the technical side of things over time. And then how does that turn into a product? And how does that product?
Yeah, so I had done a fair bit of consulting with this baseball team, with this baseball team through my previous work, and gotten to know a lot of the engineers. So I had told them about the idea. For better and worse, almost all of our early business, both hires and customers, has come through network effect and through relationship capital. It is the ancillary benefit of having spent almost a decade in industry. Of course, that creates some false positives, but that's another story. And so we created a prototype and got our first design partners, so to speak, teams who were willing to give us a try, and then just grew from there. Really, like every business, the first few things we built didn't really work or weren't exactly what customers wanted, and we've just been pivoting and pivoting from there. Really, finally landing on one customer I can talk about is Queens Park Rangers, and working with directly with their CEO, Christian Nuri. I think I've talked to him four separate times today, and the work that they're doing there with their new ownership, and they were rated with a less than 1% chance of not getting relegated from their league last year, and they finished, I believe, 8 points clear of the relegation zone. And if we were 0.1% a part of that, I'm honored. But that's just to say the sophistication of their leadership there is really something, and the turnaround that's happening at that club there is amazing. and and Christian and some of his staff there are people who want to use technology, knowing the pros and cons, knowing it won't be perfect, knowing you can't rely on every number you see, it's just a guide point, and knowing that technology can be as scary as it is exciting, but they want to be guided by it. And so I think one thing to highlight there is it takes a while to find your ideal users, and then land them. But we've finally managed to do that.
So how did that change over time? So if you can you tell me maybe what the first prototype was and then how that's different from the product you have now? I think that so many people go in with this vision of what something should be, whether it's a job, whether it's a business, whether it's a podcast, whatever it might be, and then it ends up being dramatically different after you've collected some data.
That's a great question, Ken. I think that the keys of where the product began were that even though my vision has always been to make it easier for decision makers to work with data, to turn their intuition, to turn their subject matter expertise into queries, into data insights, and to solve for that avatar, that moment where they have a question and they can't answer it themselves. They have to walk down the hallway and bother someone. Um, and that frustration, that friction point that exists between a decision maker and an engineer of sorts, we've always wanted to solve for that. But I think simply put, the first product that we built made analysts faster more than it allowed decision makers to do something that they couldn't do before. And that's no sin, but you have to reset your expectations. I think additionally, there was tech that had a huge value proposition at the time and has since been kind of surpassed by other technologies, and we baked it in, specifically automated machine learning. And that's how I became friends with Gonzo and Jepson, was by embedding the capabilities of Data Robot under our application. And I think Auto ML is a fantastic value prop, especially from a productivity standpoint, where these sports teams don't have 25 analysts; they might have five, most of them. But it's much more of a vitamin than a painkiller. And I think that age old advice to find a painkiller, because that's what will really sell. It rang very true, and we learned that lesson the hard way. And fortunately, we've been in a great position to pivot into building those more templated, more user friendly tools for decision makers.
This episode of Ken's Nearest Neighbors is brought to you by Z by HP, HP's high compute, workstation grade line of products and solutions. Z is specifically made for high performance data science solutions, and I personally use the ZBook Studio and the Z8 workstation. I really love that the Z workstations can come standard with Linux or WSL2, and they can be configured with the Data Science Software Stack Manager. With the Software Stack Manager, you can get right to the work of doing data science on day one without the overhead of having to completely reconfigure your new machine. Now back to our show.
I think that it's important to think about the nature of sports clients. I think in more broad business, you have this issue where it's such an open-ended space. There's so many infinite decisions that could be made that having flawed methodology, not that any methodology would be flawed in your case, but not having an understanding of the underlying mechanics of things can create flawed decisions that perpetuate. I think in sports or in specific domains, the outcomes and the domain is confined, right? There's only so much that can happen on a basketball. There's only so much that can happen within these confines, that it's actually a lot safer place to have some sort of automated types of tooling and technology. Obviously, you have to be careful of methodology. You have to understand the implications of the models. But if we're thinking about it in a relative way, it's really interesting to view it from that perspective. How do you feel?
Yeah, I have to admit I had never thought of it that way, and I'm stealing that for sales and marketing. I think as an example on that, let's say you're making a first round draft pick in the NFL, there can't be more than 60 or 70 players that could possibly be drafted in the first round, probably even fewer than that. The question is how you identify not just who makes the most sense, but who makes the most sense for you, right? Anyone can write an algorithm saying these are the 10 best right backs in the Premier League. But how to figure out the best one for your needs for the right reasons that's most economical, that's a little bit trickier. And how to get those answers fast enough is more tricky. So I think, I think we just had to kind of, as an industry, go through that painful period where there were some teams that had gone too far into it and were just using the numbers and just relying on quants and kind of messing it up that way. Not just because of the systems around it, but because the data might have been limited, the insights might have been flawed, and now we're at this place where it is that phrase humans plus machines, and we do realize, hey, scouts can't look at 30,000 players, so let's give them a list of 100. And scouts can also tell us some players that they really like that might not have ended up on our list. And so we can run them through and figure out why the scouts like them and come to an understanding, have a productive meeting.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. The productive meeting is a really important part. If you can tell me how to do that with every client we work with, I will. I'll happily give you more one-liners.
If I knew how to do that, Ken, I wouldn't need the startup.
Exactly. Well, something underlying that is sort of the complexity and downside risk associated with decision making, right? In sports, you can make a bad decision. It can cost you a lot of things. It can cost you some form of win multiple. It costs you a lot of these types of things. But at the very worst case, you have a losing season and you get a better draft pick usually, depending on what league you're in. From the business side of things, if you make one error and it's perpetuated and multiplied by a model, the downside risk is essentially infinite. If someone has a trading algorithm that they run wild and it makes this incredible series of bad trades that can completely implode a company. I find it very interesting that the modeling and these types of things in sports, the downside is actually capped in a different way than it is in business. And that's becoming more and more apparent to me the more I work in these domains, is like the incentive system is different because for the most part, they're lightly correlated, but wins does not necessarily directly cause more money coming to the team. They're, again, related. It's probably lightly causal, but it's not as predictive as you think. It's not like the bottom line in a business. And that also makes it hard for analytics adoption in some sense, because if there's, this less clear metric, they can go all the way up or go all the way down. How do you figure out if this is really useful in this confined setting?
Where to begin with that? I love the way you're framing it. I think, there are, what's the phrase, like victory and defeat should be treated as an equal imposter. There are teams that winning means that they end up 5 years behind because they think that they thought that they didn't need to change anything. Right. That happens all the time. I think we've even run into some avatars of clients, or at least prospects, who they won a title 3 or 4 years ago, and now they realize that they've fallen behind. And there are lots of great analytics departments that are very impactful on teams that are only above average because there are other reasons why that team is not winning more games. So it's really tough to evaluate landscapes there. I also see, just to the first part of your question or your comment, Ken, like there is some basic understanding of how to work with statistics that is often lacking at the executive level. Heck, my own engineers have to explain to me, what does done mean, and there's all sorts of things. What's a storyboard? What's a story point, and that happens everywhere in every business. So it's not to criticize, but you could say there's a 78% chance of this happening, and it doesn't happen. And they say, oh, your stats were wrong. No, they weren't. There was just something in the 22% probability. And that kind of thing happens a lot in sports. And I think we have to educate each other a little bit more.
That's so true. And it's something to what you were talking about earlier with the organizations and setting themselves back by winning. There's another side to that where I think it happens particularly in basketball. Basketball has a hard salary cap, correct? Or it's a different sport that has a hard salary cap. But I essentially sports that are salary capped, if you sell your soul for a year, you try to get all these superstars, you try to do all these things, you screw yourself for the long term.
That's right.
And it's not, you think about the probability of the best team winning a championship every year. If you look at Vegas odds, I mean, I don't know what it would be for next year, but I can't imagine it's more than maybe like 5-1, 10-1. And so you're selling your soul for that probability, when if you're looking at maximizing championships over a 10-year period, maybe it's actually a better approach to not have superstars, play a different type of basketball, sustain. I mean, the Celtics did a pretty good job of that, I think, this year.
They did, yeah.
There were I don't think any of their players were top 5 in MVP voting.
Right.
And they were still able to be able to do this. And they played great basketball the last 5 years.
Yeah, so, and no matter what happens with that roster, they'll be a playoff team next year. And I think something that the average fan doesn't consider, but probably not even people working for most teams realize, is that there's different business models, and the owners and the chief executive of each team might have a different concept amongst them of, are we trying to just do whatever it takes to get one title and then enjoy both the glory and the after effect, or are we trying to be a playoff team every year but never retire, et cetera? And there's endless amount of different models for that, and that completely should affect how you do your business.
Yeah, and that's also should affect how you do your analytics. I mean, you think that over the course of X amount of time, and this is something I've learned to do for myself and in sports, is you have to set time frames to things. So if it's, hey, over the next 100 years, I want to do this, well, you're never going to get started on it. You're not going to have a really concrete plan. If you're like, oh, in 5 years we want to do this, that's something. In 1 year you want to do this, that's another thing. And I think that's something that analytics departments have trouble doing.
Yeah, I mean, to what you said, Ken, like I love the phrase we overestimate what we can achieve in a year and underestimate what we can achieve in 10. And I think, one of the things that Gemini solves for is how most people working in analytics departments for sports teams are not getting done the things that they would like to get done. They're drowning in ad hoc requests, pushing boulders up hills on data engineering tasks. And it's not, in its own way, it's not as fun as it looks from the outside. Just like sports science was a lot of filling up water bottles and charging GPS units. And I think that we have reached a point, again, as an industry, where something's got to give. Like, we've gone through kind of Moneyball 2.0, where most teams are doing something, and now they're figuring out how to do that something in a economically efficient way that's also productive to deliver to stakeholders on an appropriate timeline, which is always, we have to win on Sunday.
Yeah. And I agree 100%. And so how do you get that buy-in into, I guess this would be analytics 3.0, where the ROI of analytics is relatively hard to evaluate in sports, especially with so many competing different models that these owners and coaches are using? I can't imagine that's an easy conversation, especially because I've been a part of those conversations before.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a very long string, a prohibitively long string from are there people building algorithms and delivering insights Are people listening to those? Are people making decisions based off those? And are those decisions resulting in an on-field outcome that's superior to what would have happened if that influence didn't exist? And is that outcome making the club more money? I mean, that's spurious. And so I think, and there's a lot of, and I say this with a lot of respect, there's a lot of clubs out there that have great reputations for being data driven. And I know this is going to be audio, but I would be using air quotes. And it's really one person doing some fairly basic stuff, but they're listened to, which is great. But how do you compare that to a staff of 10 that is only sometimes listened to? And so I think the analytics, or the Moneyball 3.0, is a world where these sophisticated team owners, right? We're seeing this huge influx of private equity and institutional investors. These sophisticated owners are putting people that have more technical backgrounds, more statistically driven backgrounds, economics, et cetera, in positions of power that allow them to collaborate with the data people. And finally, of course, self-motivated comment here, they're going to use technology to interface, right? They have to. And in the era of ChatGPT, we have to move way beyond someone in a Python notebook or pushing out Tableau dashboards, just giving insights and answers and recommendations to someone that couldn't do any of that themselves. There has to be technology in between those two people.
Amazing. I should warn you, this is a video podcast. So,
well, then air quotes there. There we go. Okay. Data driven. I'm glad I washed my hair this morning.
I didn't want to
That's
throw you under the bus.
Right. That's perfect.
If you take your shirt off or something for the second half.
I was about to. Yeah.
Words of warning. So obviously your background is in the sports performance side of things. You chose to run this company in the sports space. Were there corollaries for this working in industry or in other types of places that made a lot of sense to you, that made it reasonable for you to say, hey, we can do something similar in sports? Or was this completely organic in another sense?
Yeah, I think I was a little stunned and felt pretty naive in my own industry when I went out kind of researching, okay, I have the idea. Now what should the product be like? And I saw, products like Data Robot and Data IQ and SageMaker and others, where, look, that ultimately is a long way off from what we are bringing to market now. But just the idea that there were multi-billion-dollar companies providing self-service analytics tools and democratizing data for Fortune 500 industries. And, I'm happy to admit that a lot of our investment traction has come from people who were in the financial services world or around that world who have seen this before. They've seen Bloomberg, all these different companies that recognize that the subject matter experts should be doing these things themselves. And so how that works, how that translates from a business model and the data underneath, there are parallels, and then there are unique things. But lots of investors and operators were kind of stunned that this didn't exist in sports.
Amazing. And again, I love the Bloomberg terminal corollary. That makes a ton of sense. It's, hey,
one of my board members was their head of data.
There you go. Perfect person to talk about. I will say, I mean, in terms of sports teams, there's probably a more limited supply of teams who would use a service compared to the number of banks or bankers or whatever it might be. How do you view that in terms of market size, and if this could be a good use?
Yeah, it's a crucial question. And in terms of service versus software, I think it was actually our friend Gonzo who said, where there's smoke, there's fire. If someone is willing to pay for professional services to solve a problem, they'd much rather be paying for a software tool to do the same. And teams are spending a lot of money on professional services, whether that's to munge and architect their data feeds or to actually provide algorithms. They are paying for that, and they're paying 4, 5, 8 times what we charge, which is exciting for us, right? So I think, in a way, without wanting to sound kind of condescending to the sports industry, we're really just doing SaaS. If you think about the fundamental basis of software as a service being, here's something off the shelf so that you don't have to write code to build it and wait to have the value add. That's a big part of what we're doing. That these teams are hiring software developers, and I'm not saying that they shouldn't or that they shouldn't have their own internal apps, but they have mountains to climb, and this shortens that journey. In terms of the market size itself, there's about 30,000 global professional, collegiate, or Olympic sports teams out there. There might be about 5,000 in the very accessible world to the West. Let's put it that way. And that are spending at least $250,000 a year on either data feeds, data products of some kind, or data people. And that number, I mean, that's probably like 2019. And so the CAGR of this industry is the CAGR of this industry, I think, is 30%, and that's pre-Chat GPT and even probably pre-tracking data, where optical tracking data is just, as we've discussed, it's completely changing sports, and I don't think we're anywhere near getting consistent value out of it. So I think, knowing even the most like lower league professional, full-time professional sports teams globally are still multi-million dollar entities, to spend relatively low six figures a year on a SaaS product is going to become the norm for them, just as it was for GPS or as it is for a CRM on the business side.
So one maybe stark difference between Bloomberg and, I guess it might not be as different as I think, but with sports teams, they're all looking at very different data. They're probably mostly caring about the data that's specifically relevant to their sport. On Bloomberg, I mean, I guess they consolidate a bunch of different information if you're an options trader, if you're a different type of trader, if you're looking at these types of things. But more broadly, more people are going to be using a lot of these different data sources compared to in the sports domain, where they're really cued in on their own leagues. How do you reconcile that problem of essentially getting all this data or facilitating all this data across such a broad spectrum of different sports?
Yeah, it's kind of three different ways. The biggest one is just partnering with those data vendors. There's, in each sport, let's say a half dozen data vendors that are the known entities that are fairly ubiquitous across the sport. Monopolies and duopolies being very common in sports tech. So we partner with those companies, and for the most part, our deals with them are kind of quid pro quo, where we share marketing and things like that. And if you're Arsenal and you subscribe to StatsBomb data, and you become a customer of Gemini, you're going to get access through our application to exactly what you pay StatsBomb for, and that's cool. But it's just one step. What we do is we house that in a state-of-the-art cloud instance, so you don't have to source or put that together. And then we enrich that data in two different ways. One is architecting that together with other data sources, which probably sounds very basic to people in more fortunate industries, but just 1 + 1 = 2 is a big deal in sports. So we architect event data with tracking data, for example, and then we layer that on top with intermediate helper tables that say, oh, well, this event happened at that time in the game when the score was X, and things like that really enrich what you can get out of that data. And then finally, we layer in both publicly available data and first-party proprietary data. So there are public websites that have pretty decent information that is useful, and 99% of teams will say, yeah, I've been meaning to get to that. I just don't have time to build and maintain the scraper. And we've put it in there. And then the first party data and linking that together with the third party data, it's a pain. And every team has their GPS, every team has their scouting reports, every team has other subjective ratings and things that they collect internally that are not layered in with the data feeds that they're buying. So just putting together that data layer that's architected, enriched, and automated is the really unflashy painkiller that we see.
So you essentially absolved at least some of that painful process of collecting data, cleaning, organizing it for these teams, but you've taken it all on yourself as a company. I can't imagine that's necessarily an easy task. I mean, what does the engineering challenge look like for you guys doing that? I would imagine nonstop integrating and scraping and maintaining these systems.
Yeah, that's right, and I often joke like we employ the data engineers whose salaries you don't want to take on yourselves at the teams, um, because like that's not what teams should be focusing on. They should be hiring basketball analysts and soccer analysts, and so yeah, we have data engineers, and data architects on staff, and they do a lot of that work. The good news is that that problem scales, right? Because I don't think that there should be 350 different people at 350 different UEFA member soccer teams trying to build the same pipeline. But when we build it, then we can resell that value prop 350 times. So it works from a business standpoint. I think the key, of course, then is putting that AI layer on top, putting that semantic layer on top, having the templated metrics and models that make it really fun and really interesting to kind of, like I said, serve as the interface between decision maker and builder, but also allow that builder to stay with their most complex projects. So the answer is yes, it's a lot of work, but it scales.
It's amazing. All scaling is what we like to hear. And so one of the biggest parts of, I guess, entrepreneurship in general is scaling. Uh, and I was wondering if we could go into your journey of growing the company, but also dive into some of the aspects of you being a non-technical founder. So what are some of the challenges that you faced, how you overcame them, and maybe what you've learned along the way?
Yeah,
Loaded
man.
question. We can break it up if you want.
Yeah, how much time have you got? Look, I think one of the coolest parts about being a solo founder, I'll start there, is that I don't have to consult anyone else for any ideas I want to do. And I don't have to, I think more importantly, because that's kind of a flippant comment, right? I don't have to only consult with one person before going anywhere else. Right. I like to take a pretty democratic approach. I like to really trust my senior staff, and I can canvass opinions on matters before making an ultimate decision. From a non-technical standpoint, Ken, what I find is fun is I kind of have that, not ignorance is bliss, but like the beginner's mindset where I think if a data scientist was building this company, they might be making false assumptions about what the non-data scientist wants. And they would only be able to see things through that certain lens. And there's a lot that I don't know. And I've learned a lot about these topics, obviously, but there's so much that I still don't know. And that allows me to ask really beginner questions about things that allow us to think about the user experience differently, think about the value proposition differently. And having been, look, sports science is a long way off from the general manager of a team, but I was a practitioner working with the athletes, making decisions about the team every day, and I therefore can relate pretty well to the general manager in a way that a data scientist might not be able to. I often say that my one great talent is finding amazing and brilliant people to put together the crazy ideas in my head, and that's just what I've kind of done over and over.
I forget who it was. I think it was Steve Jobs when he was interviewed about finding talent. And someone asked him essentially why he spent so much time in the interview process. And he's like, well, if your first hire is essentially half of your company, you wouldn't want to make a mistake there. If each proximal hire is some fraction of your company, why would you
Sure.
not make sure that each individual one of those people uh, is important and relevant and aligned? And I think he said that it's not something important. It's everything important.
Yeah.
Which is a very interesting thing.
Yeah, and I'll put my hand up there. I had managed nutritionists and physiologists and doctors and strength coaches. I'd never managed a software engineer before. I'd never managed a product manager. I'd never managed a salesperson before. So I've made every mistake in the book, in those areas. And I think that that's part of the entrepreneurial journey, is that you have to learn those things, sometimes the hard way. I think what's really interesting about technology is there's a lot of stereotypes about how it's supposed to be done, but you don't have to look very hard to find a very successful example of doing it a different way. And so I think if there's been a lot of learning by doing about different models of how a company should operate, whether that's, you need to have a product manager at a staff of this size, or front end, back end, or data engineering versus data science, all of the things. I've been fed the stereotypes. I've been advised very well by my board, my advisors and angels. I've learned some things the hard way, and we've changed some things.
If you're comfortable with it, can you tell me a lesson that you've learned the hard way?
I'll give you two. Both pretty uncomfortable. One is founder-led sales and how that first million at least should be sold by the founder. I hired salespeople way too early and thought that I could just rely on them to do it and show up to a couple of the key meetings and drive the deal home. And I was very wrong about that. I think the other one is around probably product management. That it's a very trendy job position. It does a lot of important things. I don't know at what size it's necessary. I mean, we could reel off examples of companies that got very large without any, but everyone wears different hats at a startup. So why not someone wearing that one as well as others? That I think how big or how small the engineering team needs to be before having a full-time PM. I think it's much more up for debate than I realized a year ago.
So did you think that was something that was fixed? Like, hey, we get to 5 engineers, we need a PM.
Yeah.
Or then
Yeah, and I think like the appropriate calibration of move fast and break things versus how much process you have and how much you dot your i's and cross your t's will dictate how efficiently you can be and how fast you can move. Like that paradox, it's really hard to get right. And I love the idea of being very process oriented and very organized so that you can get a lot out of a little. I'm not a naturally organized person. I hire people who help me with that. Um, but you can swing that pendulum way too far and then come back to a point of hang on, we're too rigid. Let's just go. Let's just move and we can figure out the rest later once we've got the success that creates that room for us. So I think that is definitely a mistake I've made, that I've thought that by being super buttoned up, we were going to make everything easy for ourselves. And instead I made it too difficult to be creative and move fast.
just as you mentioned, towing that line, I think is probably one of the great arts in entrepreneurship. It's how do you create something that's replicable without squelching the creative freedom and the drive and the at times almost uh, irrational belief in what you're doing. And if you have too many systems, it's kind of hard to
Yeah.
be like, oh, we're actually going to do that.
Yeah, you've made me thought of kind of another two that are similar. So debate and discussion, right? You want people to feel encouraged to bring up anything, to push back against anything, and that sounds really cool. And it's a total nightmare in practice, because oftentimes you're moving so fast you can really only say no and then move on to the next thing, and that might kill someone's motivation to share next time. And so navigating that's super tricky. And similarly, I think most founders get a ton of really bad advice. And look, one of the best things a founder can do is surround themselves with people that can give great advice, that have been there and done that can see around the proverbial corners for you. It's incredibly valuable. You can also end up with a really, really unhelpful peanut gallery and paralysis by analysis. And how to canvas the opinions in front of you is I don't have the answer to that yet. I think what you have is almost seasons and topics where, hey, this thing has come up, therefore I'm going to call that board member, or I happen to be feeling very close to this board member. I'm just going to keep coming back to them with things, and then maybe they go on vacation or something, and you talk to another one for a little while. So I think again, just calibrating where you get your advice from and how you form your opinions that drive decisions is really dicey and not to be taken lightly.
Yeah, that makes sense. When you were talking about advice and those types of things, do you have any specific advice one of your advisors gave you that really could point to is like, hey, that made an unbelievably big difference, that had huge ROI?
Yeah, I've got a
Making you think a lot
few.
here.
No, yeah, I've got a few. Cliches, all of them, but probably correct more often than not. So when there is doubt, or where there is doubt, there is no doubt. And similarly, like, trust your gut feeling. That's been one for me recently. Um, Act on my gut feeling a little bit faster. Um, might not be like fortune cookie sage advice here, but just never making assumptions about communication. Isn't there a phrase like the most common failure of communication is assuming that it's happened? And that's something that I've definitely learned the hard way, is just communicating your expectations and your vision over and over and over, I think are so key. It's so easy to think that you spoke clearly and be very wrong. It's so easy to think that because you said something once that everyone is clear on it for all time. I'm trying to think of a couple of other ones. Take the money. You can never have too much money in the bank. Like that's one I totally rolled my eyes at. And then one day you're like, yep, that makes sense now. And a bad investor or a pain in the ass investor is worse than not having the money is also true.
Yeah. Those are all excellent ones. I love the one related to communicating effectively. I mean, I think probably is more relevant to me in my with my girlfriend, but it's one of these things where you clearly meant something else, but it was interpreted a different way. And there's so much subjectivity to the way that people infer from what we're describing. And I think if you're running the business, it's on you to clarify that. It's on you to elicit what
Yeah.
assumptions people have. And I think that that's very difficult for people because someone might be super structured and organized and think in a very logical way, but the people they work with might think from a not an irrational way, but just like a more like gut or a more inspired sort of way. And
Yeah,
you might get two different things out of the same work.
that's right, Ken. And I think that, you know, eh, I share that in terms of spousal communication, right? It is like, I think every human every single day at least once communicates something that they thought was really clear and it was not clear to the receiver. And especially as a generation, almost we can work on that a lot. But you did remind me of one final one there. It's both a lesson learned and a advice communicated. Is it sounds really cool to have people that think totally differently in one room on one team. That's a lot harder in practice, and so I think being thoughtful, it doesn't mean don't do it, but being thoughtful about how you put those puzzle pieces together and how you communicate your expectations of your way of working and of your way of communicating, right? Was this a thought? Was this a demand? Was this a recommendation? That requires more work than most people assume.
That's a really good point. And I think when you have someone or people that do have opposing opinions, it's kind of important to have at least some form of hierarchy because at the end of the day, a decision has to be made. And if the two people are either equally ranked or equally viewed socially with decision making power, that could lead to really bad things. I
Oh,
mean, again, not to bring up Steve Jobs again, but there was no questions around the decisions that were made at Apple, but you always welcome the pushback, which I think is really.
yeah. I love when people tell me that I'm wrong. I always make them tell me why. But you know, if I'm not being told that I'm wrong about things, then we probably have a culture problem. I do think that disagree and commit, the Amazon policy, is one of the most overspoken about and underused things out there. That's probably a very clumsy way to say it, but lots of people like to talk about it. Very few people are good at it. And I think to your hierarchy comment, like that's one of the toughest things as a founder is that you're going to completely see why people see things a certain way and still have to do the opposite for reasons that they won't understand every single day. There's a right amount and a wrong amount to explain things to your staff. And I think we can all learn from a lot of different CEOs out there because there's so many different ways of doing it.
So for those that aren't familiar, could you explain the disagree and commit?
Yeah, as I understand it, Amazon had as a key part of their culture that you have to be adept at being able to communicate that you don't see something the same way as it's being presented or recommended, but uh, acquiesce, but conform, and that's a part of a healthy working culture. And I think that is like that's a lot harder to do than it sounds. I think it's a great hypothetical. I think most people are like I'm bad at that. And most people just want to be understood in so many situations in life, and so there's an appropriate amount of communicating why you disagree, and there's a right time to communicate that you disagree, and most people, myself very much included, are not very good at figuring out how to do that.
Amazing. I think that is so prevalent in almost all work. Obviously, a bunch of friends that worked at Amazon, and I would like to think they're pretty good at that skill. Or maybe it's been beaten into them over time. Jake, where can people learn more about what you're working on? Where can they get in contact with you? Uh, where can they just go to learn more about Gemini as well?
Yeah, so my personal social media is quite cheesily named after my favorite movie character, Cool Hand Luke. So my social media handles are actually to this day at Cool Hand Jake GS, which is my initials. But probably more easily, you can find us at Gemini Sports with an S at the end, geminisports.ai. And I am Jake at geminisports.ai.
Amazing. This is incredible. Is there anything that I should have asked, but I didn't?
No, I think, and this is probably one for another episode, is I think just in this AI age, I'm fascinated in the productization of it all. And I think vertical solutions are the way. Obviously, I'm biased there, but just that I think these broad products are a great basis for tech and a great learning point. But that the more AI drives our work, the more domain specific products are going to become. And so I'm very excited to see that space develop.
Yeah, well, it is developing faster than any of us would have imagined right now. So,
That's for sure.
so why don't we have another conversation about that in maybe 6 months when the entire landscape's
I
completely
was going to
changed?
say in 15 minutes. Yeah.